I think this group of folks who, is a group of really fierce monopoly fighters knows very well that we're in a moment in our economy where monopoly is really the name of the game. It truly is what runs our entire economy and sets the rules. And, I see this through Acre's work on corporate power, and we see it across lots of different issue areas through the coalition that Acre co-founded, Athena, which exists to take on Amazon and push forward democracy in our economy. We see this perhaps in its most egregious form in Amazon, this enormous monopoly of monopolies. But with this consolidation of power, we also have the potential to consolidate some of our fights in a way that makes 1 + 1 = 10 million. So monopoly helps link our fights for freedom by highlighting the interest and role consolidated corporate power plays in making everything about our society work for it instead of us. So I think this group of people is a great group of people to try and figure out how do we make our economy work for us, and dismantle monopoly power as one of the first steps there. So lastly, I will say that this is the first of 3 ongoing conversations. 2 of those will be private workshops, and 1 will be a public-facing event, which we'll hear more about later on in this meeting. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my really good friends and the co-founders and co-EDs of Liberation and Generation, Jeremie and Solana.
Thanks, Maurice. Hi, I'm Solana Rice. I am co-founder and co-executive director of Liberation in a Generation. I am so delighted to have this conversation with you all. Liberation in a Generation, for those who might be new to us, is a national movement support organization. And our aim is to build an economy that we've never seen, one that centers people of color and where all people of color belong. And we have had the just extreme pleasure of getting to know many people on this call. And in the work of trying to understand the role of corporate power in really shutting down and stalling our racial justice movements. We are building a policy platform that is more like a library and a resource that we hope is helpful for organizers and organizers of color across the country. And when we started to dig into corporate power, what we realized is that there was a need to talk about the role of monopoly and the role of corporate concentration in our oppression economy. And so this first event is really a foray into that. This is not, we're not going to come away with like, great, solve that, fantastic. This is very much a first conversation. And Jeremie, why don't you introduce yourself, and then I'll go into the presentation.
Yep, Jeremie Greer, co-founder, co-executive director of Liberation and Generation. All the stuff Solana said, and looking forward to this conversation we're gonna have today.
Great, I'll share my screen. And we'll just jump in. First, we want to acknowledge that this is definitely a partnership. Liberation in a Generation holds partnerships very dear. We're so glad to have the support of the Economic Security Project and the Anti-Monopoly Fund more specifically. On your screen, you'll see a long list of advisors that have helped us shape the report. And if you haven't had a chance to check out the report, I'm sure someone will throw a link to it in our chat. This is definitely a labor of love for me and Jeremie, and also a collective effort from the many folks you see listed on the screen here. Just quickly, we're just going to take like a quick 10 minutes to level set. What is monopoly? What does it mean for people of color? What does it mean for our racial economic justice movements? What do we do now? Now that we've sort of understand more about it. And with that, I'm actually just going to turn it over to Jeremie to dig in.
Yeah, so one thing that this report, one of the things where we really wrote this report with the idea that it could be a resource to grassroots leaders on the ground. And it operates on the assumption that grassroots leaders are actually the ones that are going to lead the charge and lead the movement to take down these monopolies. And it starts with, like, what is a monopoly? It was a question that we kind of asked ourselves, and we thought is that it's not that easy to define, right? It's defined in many ways. It's evolved over the years, but what we used is this definition that we put on the screen. And what we think that this definition does is it encompasses really the economic power and governing influence that monopolies have, and then also talks about the different groups of people that monopolies impact. And that a lot of that has, and in the report, we focus a lot on these kind of monopolies, big tech, big pharma, big ag, and big banks. But there are also monopolies. There's monopolies in retail. There's monopolies in hospitality. There's monopolies all across our economy. Solana, if you hit the next slide. And I'm just going to talk about a few observations that we had that we think are really germane to the conversation that we're going to have today about how we connect this anti-monopoly work to movement work that's already happening out in the field. And we're going to kind of walk through some of these. And the first kind of observation we had is that monopoly power is corporate power magnified and maximized. And why we believe that that's important is because grassroots leaders are the ones who've been fighting corporate power really since grassroots movements have ever even existed. And as it relates to grassroots leaders of color, it's what we know is that this corporate power is what drives the racial capitalism and what we at Liberation Generation call an oppression economy, an economy where corporations profit from racism. They suppress the economic vitality through those profits they derive from racism. They use those resources to suppress the political power of people of color. And then that restrains the ability of people of color to influence the democracy that governs the economy that allows racism to be profitable. So we have to understand that monopolies are operating in this context and in its economy. Next slide. And that, again, something that grassroots leaders of color know is that who's driving that corporate power are the monopolists, right? And the monopolists tend to do well when the rest of us are feeling the pain and when communities of color are feeling the pain. And no more has that been evident than in this current COVID-19 crisis, where people like Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, Warren Buffett grew huge profits between March of 2020 and October of 2020, which was at the kind of epicenter of when the economy was really hit hard by the current COVID-19 and has wrought so much pain and harm on communities of color across the country that these people continued to make profits, massive record-breaking profits during this time. And that the other thing that grassroots leaders know is they know that you have to have targets, right? And that campaigns focus on targets. They focus on the CEOs, they focus on corporate boards, and they also focus on shareholders. And this is a slide thanks to the B Lab. Jay Cohen Gilbert is on the call. The whole idea of shareholder primacy that drives the decisions that corporations make is inherently structurally racist, right? Like 90% of people who own shares in companies are white people. And when you talk about the value of the equity and mutual funds that these companies comprise of, only 1.5% of Black people households own some sort of share in corporate equity and the mutual fund value. That is in itself driving the kind of inequality that we see and is really determining who's making the rules of our economy. Another thing that we want to focus in on is the consequences of monopoly power. And from our observation, it is something that is driving racial wealth inequality in this country, and has been forever. You go back to right before the Civil War, the place that had the most millionaires per capita, which were the billionaires of the time, was the Mississippi Valley. And they were slaveholder plantations. And that the combined value of the slaves they owned were the largest asset in the entire country at the time. That's bigger than the railroads and manufacturing at that time. So this is not a new phenomenon that we've seen with this monopoly power leveraging and utilizing and oppressing the bodies of people of color to glean wealth. And that those monopolies exacerbate racial wealth inequality by harming workers of color, harming consumers of color, harming businesses that are owned by people of color, that is infringing on the privacy of people of color. And the panel will talk about some of these ways in which this is happening, and is really weakening the economic and political power of communities of color. One example that I want that we have in the report is, Black businesses are also held up as the way we're going to close the racial wealth gap by starting more Black businesses. Well, if you look at Black farmers in the South, chicken farmers in particular, you see that a corporation like Cox Foods, who is the 5th largest poultry processor in the country, and how their business practices has really replicated the sharecropper model and how they treat Black farmers and chicken farmers in the South. They're determining the ways in which that they have to raise their chickens. They're determining the price at which they purchase their chickens. And in many cases are driving more and more Black farmers completely out of business in places like Mississippi. And with the last lesson, I'm going to turn it back to Solana, and she's going to carry us out the rest of the way.
So we mentioned at the top that we are not coming with a set of solutions, but what we do know is that we need to center, one, people of color, and two, organizers that are focusing on these targets and are understanding the many dimensions that Jeremie mentioned of the consequence of corporate power, right? So we understand that grassroots leaders of color are already making an impact. And now we need to figure out how to make sure that these solutions are translating into bigger and bigger scales, right? And we give an example actually in the report about the amazing and awesome work of both the Los Angeles Federation of Workers and the Warehouse Workers Resource Center in Southern California. During the COVID crisis, we saw not only Amazon, but several companies just really disregard the health and safety of their workers in a global pandemic, right? And so we were so heartened to see this win in Southern California that resulted in worker health councils being developed so that everyone could be monitoring and the safety practices and the violations that were happening in Amazon. And I think just one other point about the report and what we're navigating is that we do have existing laws. And so there's a whole set of folks and advocates working on existing laws in the Department of Justice and the FTC. But we also have cases like this where we see real worker power. That's another place to really invest in curbing corporate power. There are a set of great folks, our partners over at Athena, focusing on breakup and structural separation, also really important. There are conversations about starting a new agency about how do we regulate across all these issues. Our conclusion is that we probably need all of these solutions and more, and that the conversation needs to start in spaces like this one. So with that being said, we want to emphasize, you don't have to take our word for it. You all probably see some familiar faces on this screen. I'm going to exit out and actually turn it over to Maurice, who will guide us through this fantastic panel. It's going to be electric. I'm so excited. And yes, we can absolutely share these slides after. Thanks for the question, Wendy.
Thanks, Solana and Jeremie. And yeah, what a rock star panel we have coming up here. So I am going to introduce this panel, which is all about connecting monopoly power to other movement spaces and really how we bridge those things across the frame of monopoly power. We have 4 amazing panelists who are going to answer a couple of questions on that topic. I'll just quickly introduce them and then we'll get into our first question. Damon Drummer is the co-founder and ED at the New Consensus. Myasia Hayes, campaign strategies director at Media Justice. Tara Raghavir is the director of KC Tenants and the director of the Homes Guarantee campaign based at People's Action. And then Sean Sebastian, senior strategist of the People and Planet First in Rural America campaign at People's Action as well. So these are like actually some of my very, very good friends. So I'm very excited to hear what they're going to say to these 3 questions I have. So we'll start and we'll just go in order. The first one I'm going to throw out to you to start, Damon, and then you can just pass it to the next person. We have about 30 minutes total, so maybe 2 or 3 minutes on this question. Is when or how did you personally realize that fighting monopoly power was a racial justice issue?
I love that question. And first of all, fantastic report, LibGen, and just happened to be here. I'm going to keep my responses very short because I want to, 30 minutes ain't a lot of time. So cut me off as needed. I grew up as an Army brat. My father was in the military. My parents split up. So what we saw was that my brother and I, my twin brother and I, had free healthcare on the Army base, and my mother did not. My mother worked full time and could not afford her medication that she needed to, she had a thyroid condition. That scenario is what drove me to study economics. And so I began to question this idea of how do these pharmaceutical companies have the power to set these rates and just pretty much hold the entire country hostage to their prices. Later learning that the government subsidizes, right? We, the people, subsidize a lot of their research, if not all of it, in some form or another. And so before I was even understanding the racial equity lens and getting my head around that, it was my own house and watching my mother not be able to afford medication that got me on this, kind of got the ball rolling on all of this interrogating of all the economic structures that we live in. So it was pharmaceuticals for me. That's where it started. And now I can't even turn the lights on without like cringing. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's a very interesting and sure common story with lots of folks in this country. I'm going to pass it to Myasia for the same question. How did you realize that fighting monopoly power is a racial justice issue?
For sure. Yeah, congratulations on the report, y'all. And thank you so much for inviting me to this conversation. I'm really excited to be in this space and have Maurice facilitating. I was like, count me in. But basically, honestly, before I joined Media Justice, I was actually working pretty explicitly on decarceration campaigns in New York. So I was working on like close Rikers, I was doing bailouts. And a large reason behind why I got involved in this work was because of my own personal experience with my grandfather, who was a member of the Panther Party and then spent 45 years incarcerated in the state of New York. So growing up, like I got involved in this work because I was like working on parole and trying to get my grandfather out. And if you're familiar with having a loved one inside, you know that visitation can be really challenging and difficult for all sorts of reasons. And in my case, throughout my grandfather's incarceration, he would be transferred to facilities pretty much damn well near like the Canadian border. And I'm in Brooklyn, so that's like a 10 to 12 hour drive one way. So phone calls were like our primary like way of communicating and staying in touch. And if you knew my grandfather, you knew that he loved to talk and we were very close, right? So like, if he could call back after the first 30 minutes, he'd call right back after the first 30 minutes, right? And we talk regularly on the phone. So I share all of this to say that like, before you know it, like I have my regular phone bill and then I have my Securus Global Tel-Link phone bill. That's another $50, $60, $70, $80 a month. Now, I didn't really understand what was the cost behind those phone calls until actually I got to Media Justice, which is when I was the national organizer on criminal justice and tech. And it was at Media Justice that I understand that part of the reason why the cost of those phone calls were the way that they were was because of who was really dominating the prison phone industry. It's pretty much dominated by two companies. Over the course of time, there were more, but Global Tel-Link and Securus have pretty much merged and gobbled up a lot of other providers. And so when you're the only kind of company in town, right, like you get to pretty much set and decide what the rules are. That's why you were seeing in certain states where like a 15-minute phone call was $20, right? And now, like, as they're offering like email and other ways of communicating with your loved one inside, like these things are typically free, unless you have a loved one inside, right? And so frankly, like through that work, Prison Phone Justice was one of the first criminal justice campaigns that Media Justice did. It predates me, honestly. But as I came into Media Justice and started learning more about that work, it became really clear to me that like, and also through my own personal experience, that like families were not the customers in this scenario. It's the facility that's actually the customer, right? And when companies are able to dominate these markets in that kind of way, going back to like being able to write the rules, right? Like now we're starting to see these companies, and to be transparent, I'm still learning more about this, but like Securus and Global Tel-Link are also surveilling our phone calls, like actually collecting biometric data of our voices, right? Because like the next big thing right now is voice recognition, which is a perfect segue into like another, as we were talking about Amazon. So I'll shut up because I know we only have so much time, but like, it's the same thing with Amazon, right? Like they didn't buy Amazon Ring because they really care about home surveillance systems, right? Their business models are predicated off of extracting our data and surveilling us. And part of the reason why they're able to do this is because they dominate these markets. So I'll stop there.
Absolutely. It's great. Tara, same question for you.
Yeah, this is a great question. I feel like it's impossible to be a tenant organizer without realizing every day the influence of this kind of oppression economy on everything about the way that our people get to live. You know, I think about April 2019 when I met a woman in Kansas City named LaTanya Bowman, who was a worker at Amazon warehouse at the time, but living in her car because she couldn't afford her home, right? And then I think about June of last year, 2020, when we got calls to Casey Tenants about a tenant kind of uprising that was happening at 16th and Jackson on the east side of Kansas City in a property owned by a landlord called the Millennia Companies, based in Ohio. And the Millennia Companies like to think that they're hot shit. They're nowhere close to like a monopoly power, right? But they function within this economy that is shaped by those monopoly powers, by the big banks from which they get their loans. And as we start to peel back the layers of that scenario in organizing with the Gabriel Tower Tenants Union from that property, we see the ways in which HUD is in the mix, fighting not for the people, but for the big banks and the landlord, right? The city money, the city tax incenting agencies are in the mix, not to work for the people, but to take money actually from our public schools and subsidize these landlords to own these properties, right? So it's all part of this kind of rigged system that exists around us when we organize tenants and organize around housing issues. And then I think much more fundamentally, you know, when Solana and Jeremie were sharing their kind of definitions of monopoly and how we can think about these actors in our economy, everything about land and housing policy in this country is predicated on protecting white property, white profits, white wealth, and securing it into the future. And again, that shapes everything about the oppression economy around this issue on housing, but every issue that we're talking about here, where there are majority white shareholders of majority white mega corporations that advance white supremacist policies and practices, leaving us in this kind of hostage scenario that Damon described before. I think that's the perfect way to put it, right? We think about this all the time when we talk about the Homes Guarantee campaign, which is a campaign that aims to transform housing from commodity to public good and guaranteed human right. But by this conspiracy of the profiteers, they will have us convinced, and they have so many of us convinced, that there's no other way to do housing but through the private market. there's no other way, right? That is that hostage scenario where they have limited our imagination of what is possible, to the extent that I sound out of my damn mind when I propose that we could guarantee that everyone has a home. So anyway, all to say, I think this is a question that's so important, and one that I feel I'm getting clearer about every single day that I wake up and I organize tenants.
Great. Last but not least, Sean, same question for you.
Yeah, so I'm from Iowa, and like post 2016, I kind of like woke up and was like, how is my congressman a Nazi? My congressman was Steve King. And I just was like, what happened, right? Like, I'm brown, I'm Indian, I grew up in a 95% white state, but I was not contending with Nazis in the cafeteria or anything like that. It was this thing that was like, what happened? So I moved back to Iowa, and I asked, I embedded with the organization, Iowa Citizens for Community Improvement. And I was like, why is my congressman a Nazi? And they were like, you cannot understand the politics of Iowa without understanding corporate ag monopolies. So for me, my entry point was white supremacist authoritarianism, and it led immediately to corporate monopolies. And as I was kind of like digging in and doing more work on this, you know, like a lot of people think of rural areas as rural equals white, rural equals conservative, but 1 in 5 people who live in rural areas are people of color. And as I was digging in and connecting with folks like Navina Khanna from the Heal Food Alliance, who's on this call and has been like an amazing teacher on all of these things, when we look at the Latino meatpacking workers who Tyson Foods managers were taking bets on which one of them would get sick and die, their enemy is meat monopolies. When I look at indigenous folks who are trying to secure clean water, their enemy is these massive CAFOs that are poisoning the water. When you look at Black farmers whose land has been stolen from them, not just a while ago, but extreme, like every year right now, ongoing, that is a function of corporate ag monopolies. And everything about our politics is being driven by that. And in some of these places, like Midwestern states where extreme right-wing white supremacists are taking over the major levers of government, they're making moves at the behest of corporate ag monopolies. The first thing in Iowa that Governor Kim Reynolds did was give meat monopolies carte blanche to decide how safe the meat packing companies should be, to regulate themselves. That's like the first thing that happened. And you can like trace back a lot of these people. What are they doing in addition to pushing extremely racist, fascist, authoritarian ideas? They're serving corporate ag monopolies as well.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. So just in that first question, we have a bunch of different issue areas, from prescription drugs to the environment, decarceration, housing, ag. We heard about, the effects on Black folks, Latino workers, folks who, have family that are on the inside, tenants, et cetera. It seems like, it's sort of self-explanatory even how monopoly connects to so many of the constituent groups that, we organize and the folks on this call organize. But I don't see a lot of talk about monopoly, anti-monopoly in our advocacy work at large. And I'm curious if you all have a perspective on what some of the challenges to integrating anti-monopoly advocacy are into the campaigns that we're all working on. So what's stopping that from really getting down deep into the campaign? And I'll open it up to anyone to start.
Well, I feel like Tara actually hit the nail, or at least for me, on the head with this question, because you talked about imagination, and that's what I struggle with in our campaigns, is like a real profound lack of imagination about what our alternatives can be. And I'm not saying like from us or, like we're trying and people here are trying, but I mean in like the broader field, right? Like nobody was saying that we could get free phone calls. Why? Because prison phone companies were telling us, right, that the only way that we could provide this service to people is if we burden the families to pay for it, right? And it's so funny because as I was thinking about this, you see this throughout, right? That these companies like Facebook and Amazon spend millions of dollars lobbying, marketing, advertising. Like they have a whole strategy around making sure that we don't have the imagination to think differently, and to ensure that the only way that we can, provide this service or deliver your packages is if it's going to come at the expense of Black and Brown people. And funny enough, there was a report that came out today, I think from Public Citizen, because I was looking for the numbers. I was like, how much does Jeff Bezos actually spend on? It's millions, right? Like these are the most. So I would check out that report from Public Citizen. But for me, it's really the lack of imagination, and then using frameworks like we want more competition. Actually, we don't, right? Like we don't want more prison phone companies competing with Securus and Global Telling. We don't want more AWS or Amazons to be competing with Amazon Ring, right? Like we want an economy that actually works for our people, without actually exploiting us as well, right? So I just wanted to say that.
Yeah. Sean or Tara or Damon, I saw you come off mute there.
Yeah, I'll just briefly add to that. I think that's exactly right with imagination. I think, the logical conclusion to a lot of these structural monopolies that are sanctioned by, state and local governments, we're talking about energy and, electrical utilities, natural gas utilities, until those are completely phased out, is that there are domains like broadband internet where you do want somebody laying down this infrastructure. It doesn't make sense to have, like this foot of power line. Does this, that doesn't make any sense. But I would say in these markets, right, so-called, insofar as a natural kind of a more effective and efficient way of doing this is to have an economy of scale and that single entity managing this for a region, that should be a public good. Right? Because we see in Illinois that the only way in Northern Illinois for our utility to make money, not the only way, but one of the clear ways is to literally bribe the government to allow it to charge higher rates and then bill, ratepayers for power plants that aren't functioning and say we can't afford to transition off of natural gas. And it's all, it's a hustle, it's theft. And we have our natural gas utility in Chicago, executing what they call it a business model. I'm not an energy person. I'm always learning this stuff. It's theft. It's highway robbery that's happening every day and every month we pay our utility bill. They literally have to upgrade their infrastructure in this monopoly that they have, this territory, and they bill that upgrade to ratepayers, which means fewer people can afford their heating bill, which means more families are going cold in the winter, and which means rates go up and the cycle goes on. This is theft, and this is not a way to run any society. And so I think one barrier is getting our heads around that a lot of this stuff, broadband internet, right? Connectivity, this stuff and power distribution these need to be public goods. And that's just contending with that. That's a big fight, right? And so it's just having to embrace that. So I think I completely agree with Tara and Maisha. Imagination is a critical component.
Yeah.
Tara, go ahead, Tara. I know we've been. I feel challenged by this question as a housing organizer myself. So I'm curious what, as a housing organizer, I really look up to what your answer is here.
Yeah, it's super hard. One just quick anecdote I want to share, just because it just occurred to me that this happened a couple of weeks ago. Is I was around a fire with a bunch of. I hope I'm not offending anyone here, but like middle-aged boomer white people, my partner's family, and and someone there was talking about vaccine distribution and how horrible it's been in a lot of places that need it the most. And the kind of dominant narrative around that fire was like, Amazon could do this way better, don't you think? And eventually the conversation turned to me and they were like, don't you think Amazon could do this way better? And I was like, at what cost? At what cost? right? At what cost could Amazon do this better? So I think like one of the first challenges in integrating this type of anti-monopoly advocacy into our campaigns and in the work that we do is that we are combating a dominant narrative about the supremacy of the private market that is so profound, so deep, right? And people on this call, I think, have long-standing critiques of that private market, but like the dominant narrative is still that the private market is working. It's working for certain types of people, of course, but like that level of nuance is lost. So I think like that's one major challenge that I can point to. And inherent in that challenge is kind of similar things to what Maisha and Damon were saying. Like there's a strategy here to keep that dominant narrative dominant, which is a strategy to defund, deregulate public systems so that they fail, right? So that's like one big picture thing. Then when we drill in on housing, I think this is super hard, right? Like if I roll up into the tenant meeting on Saturday and I'm like, we're taking on monopoly power, everyone is just gonna have their eyes glaze over and probably exit out my Zoom meeting, right? So in housing, I think it's so complicated because there are so many funding streams, so many players, no one really knows who their landlord is. And of course, all of that is by design. So it's a really difficult thing, I think, to break down monopolies as the thing that we need to fight into the level of like, it's hard to break that down and make that relevant to someone who's like, I'm being evicted in April. Like, tell me what to do about that. I don't give a hoot about Wells Fargo right now, even though, if we had 3 hours with them, we might be able to break down like, that's actually the target. That's the evil player. That's the one who's created the conditions for this to be possible. So anyway, there's a lot more to say, but I think like it's a really complicated thing. One shout out that I want to make is I think in talking about anti-monopoly advocacy as a racial justice issue, we're already taking a step towards making that presentation that I take to the tenant meeting more applicable to the people in my base, right? I think folks will connect with this more if it is both a race and class issue, if it's an issue about racial capitalism, than if it's just presented as something about like, a couple of men with a lot of money sitting someplace that they can't really connect the dots to. Yeah.
I think another thing that's a challenge in my work is that, oftentimes we'll look at the conditions of Latino meatpacking workers and see that as a labor rights issue or an immigrant rights issue. And then we'll look at poisoned water that corporate ag is like, giving hundreds of people cancer every year. And that's an environmental issue. And then there's family farmers who are struggling to make ends meet and committing suicide. And then that's a corporate concentration issue. And when in actuality, all of these different constituencies and issues and people all relate to the same problem, which is the concentration, which is corporate concentration and the same handful of bad guys. So I think like being able to kind of connect our respective struggles to the very few players that are causing those problems is a really important step. And I just want to like double emphasize the points that Maisha and Damon were making about the antitrust conversation shouldn't just be about competition. It should also be about public goods and what goods should be public and what good. And so I think it's like we need a bit like more sophistication on that on our side. And then to just really emphasize what Tara said also, we need ways to make that to communicate how that's going to help people who are struggling right now. Because oftentimes when you're talking about federal policy and federal legislation to make a systemic change, like who knows how far in the future, when I can't drink my water today, that's a real challenge. So I think there's a way that we can do our organizing where we are helping people in the here and now, and also not just dealing with the downstream effects, but orienting people to the source of the problem as we're meeting people's immediate needs.
That's great. So we're down to our last question here. So it's a very simple question. It's slightly fun too. So if you had 3 minutes with Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, Jamie Dimon, you're a monopolist of choice, what would you tell them? And before you answer, I want to remind you both that Zoom uses Amazon Web Service as their cloud platform, and that this meeting is being recorded. And let's start with Tara on this one.
You're going to start with me? Oh, God. Okay. I think what I would tell them is gutsy, we're coming for you. This is kind of me channeling my, I have the ultimate privilege of getting to organize with grassroots leaders every damn day. So I think on days when I'm feeling hopeless, all I have to do is call Janae, Tiana, Gaddafi, Ashley, any of these leaders at my base, and they remind me why they show up every day. And what's clear to me is as hard as it would be for me to run up in a tenant meeting and present on an anti-monopoly strategy this Saturday, after months of and years of political education with leaders like the leaders in the KC Tenants base and leaders in the Homes Guarantee campaign across the country, there's a really sharp collective analysis about what we need and about the fact that our demands for a homes guarantee are not radical. It's actually what our people are owed. People are very, very clear on that, right? So I think the main thing I would say is we're coming for you. Keep doing your thing, I guess. You're evil, 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 but we're coming for you.
I love it. Maisha?
Well, honestly, the first thing that came to mind is for everybody watching, please join Media Justice's watch party tomorrow, because we're blasting Mark Zuckerberg and these CEOs when they testify at these hearings and espouse all of this narrative about how much their innovations have helped the public good. Join us tomorrow. It's going to be fun. But that is a good segue into what I would personally say, right? Is that you can't really be a part of, you can't say that you want to be a part of the solution, but you're also a part of the problem. And that's a lot of what these CEOs do, right? They use this propaganda and this narrative around their genius or their innovation and have us convinced, that because they are innovators, right? And because they are offering this public or good, that we should ignore the realities of violence and harm that they're committing in our communities elsewhere. Jeff Bezos said, "Oh, I'm happy to lose customers last summer," but he wasn't happy to lose law enforcement as a customer, apparently. I would just say you can't have it both ways. You need to pick a side. And to echo Tara, we're coming for you.
Love it. Daman?
I mean, similar is I wouldn't have much to say. It's I'll see you in the streets, which is probably more than a veiled threat, but that's where we're gonna fight them, and this work that LibGen is doing, it is fuel, it's framing, it's fuel, and we got to take it to them. I mean, the reality is that our government, right? If we can get control of that government, it's enabling all of this, right? So ain't much talking to do with these folks, right? we get out there and get it, and we shut it down. And then I asked during the prep call, I asked if we could cuss, so I'm not going to cuss, but yeah, I'll speak in preach is what it is.
I love it. Sean?
I just tell them look, this is inevitable. You're screwing over way too many people. It's Black people, Latino people, Indigenous people, immigrants, all of us, and your time's coming up. So let's talk about retirement. What are your hobbies? Watercolor, bird watching, you're gonna have to get into it because you're not gonna be running monopolies much longer.
I love it. And I understand my reputation enough to know that I wouldn't be ever allowed in such a meeting. So I would just echo you all from the outside, and maybe send an email saying that they'll just go down in history as common racist and nothing special at all, because that's what I've devoted my life to making sure of.